And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this part 21 of Mussolini, an Italian American perspective. Okay, guys, I am really trying to get down to the bottom of the relationship between Benito Mussolini and Pope Pius XI, because everything I've ever read between the two men, there's lots of contradictory facts all the way around. And it seems as if whether you come from a communist camp or classical liberal camp, and then you look at more of a, I guess you want to call it the fascist camp, it's almost as if everybody's picking and choosing timelines in history to make a political point, right? You have Jews and classical liberals that pick and highlight in the relationship between the two men points that support the liberal narrative. You have Catholic fascists that pick and support the narrative to support sort of a more moderate relationship between the two men. It seems that there's a wide, vast array of opinions, and usually it comes down to how you want to perceive your facts and picking timelines in which support the narrative of the story you're trying to build. And I find that a little bit curious. And I think part of the problem is this, right? Fascism, with its association in World War II with Nazism, has been vanquished to the ash heap of history. And so everybody sees it as a negative connotation. And maybe that's a fair assessment, right? For me, it's not a good enough assessment. I think there's more nuance there, as I've laid out in this podcast. But I understand from a Western liberal perspective, or even a far leftist Marxist perspective, I understand why they take that position. To me, that's always been kind of short-sighted as I delve deeper into Italian fascism and the history of Mussolini in Italy. And so it's kind of a pick and choose thing that bothers me. And I'm going to lay out the timeline as I best remember it, as I've read multiple sources on this, right? And I'll reveal some of my sources. And let me start here, because I did find a very interesting book today. And this is probably where I need help, okay? And that is a book titled Botched Victory: How World War II Caused Vatican II and Corrupted the Christian West. Published June 3rd, 2023 by author Patrick Peters. I don't know anything about Patrick Peters. I don't know who he is. And maybe that's what I want to ask you guys out there. I tried to do some basic research on who he is. I believe he's a Catholic writer from description of the book, but this is what the book lays out, okay? Because this is going to be important in nailing down the relationship between Mussolini and Pope Pius XI and how both men work together. Remember, from the Raquel Mussolini biography of Mussolini, Raquel said when the conclave was going on, that which eventually elected Pope Pius XI, Mussolini ran down to the square of St. Peter's Basilica. And she said he was excited because, remember, Mussolini being a Roman, he called what was happening with the again, Catholic, the church conclave was one of the great traditions of Rome. He was very excited about it, right? And later on, we learn that, and again, this is part of the timeline, so I'm going to kind of, pick and choose here how I explain this, but both men eventually saw eye to eye and could work together because both men came from peasant backgrounds, from peasant stock, which gave them a common bond, right? But anyways, this book, Botched Victory, I've just ordered it. It'll be here in a couple of days. I'm going to start going through it here. The description on this is fascinating to me, right? And let me read this to you short. The Catholic Church guided the West for centuries, overseeing enemies from Nero to Napoleon. So why did she slip into scandals and irrelevance just a few decades starting from the 1950s? And why did Christian Europe lose its glory and its faith so quickly after triumphing over Nazi tyranny in 1945, in making its case that World War II caused Vatican II and the de-Christianization of the West. This provocative, well-researched history explores, one, the bitter struggle fought by Pope Pius XI, Benito Mussolini, and the modernists in the intra-war Europe, how a cabal of heretics exploited the anti-fascist resistance to infiltrate the church, the role of the American military played in the rise of the modern mafia, why an Italian parliamentary election was crucial to Giovanni Montini becoming Pope Pius VI, the influence of Karl Marx on modern globalism, and much more. Okay, so this has to do with the church, right? And as you guys know, I have argued that Mussolini being the last temporal defender of the church, the moment Mussolini was assassinated, and now the Bolsheviks in the East in America colluded on Italy for that war source to be settled. That's why we have a bunch of corruption in the elections of 1946 and 1948. Who was going to win the soul of Italy after fascism was vanquished? Well, it was one form of liberalism or another. It was either going to be the classical liberal Protestantism, or it was going to be Bolshevikism or Bolshevism from the Soviet Union. And here, and I would have to do a research timeline, but from my memory, is really the first time that the church has to govern from a standpoint of liberalism, right? Where liberalism is a dominant societal and political ideology, and the church now is left to kind of have to deal in this world. Yes, you could argue that under King Emmanuel, after the Risorgimento, the Italian Revolution, you had a liberal government of sorts there. True, but this wasn't Anglo-Protestant liberalism, and that wasn't Bolshevism. And ultimately, that's why the king turned to Mussolini to push out the Bolsheviks. So, from my simple connection of things in history, the problems in the church really happened after Mussolini falls. Now, could you say that they started a little bit earlier, that the church was being infiltrated? Absolutely, absolutely. But the moment the Americans come into Italy after World War II and implement democracy, a democracy that was implemented under great controversy because there was lots of irregularities in the Italian elections of 46 and 48, because the Americans had a lot of problems. One of the problems well, first of all, from my understanding, and this is from historian Charles Colomb, in 1946, which was the vote that ousted the monarch, right? That was a bunch of ballot stuffing going on. We know that the Allies in America wasn't going to allow a fascist regime to win power, or for the king to stay in power after fighting that war. So there was lots of irregularities in that election. That election, I think you could probably argue, was fixed. And then in the 48 election, which would have been the first parliamentary government, there was another problem that the American State Department had, and that was the communists were about to win the election, right? And this is where you get Operation Gladio and the State Department working with the mafia, and to some extent even the Vatican, to make sure the communists didn't win that election, right? And the funny thing about it is that the mafia winds up taking such extreme tactics where they start, how should I say this? Mingling in the streets with the communists, and many of the tactics that the fascists used against the communists, that fascism was always criticized for, with the assistance of the American State Department, the mafia was kind of doing the same thing. But we don't look at these things from a clear lens when we have a bias that's initiated. And so there's a lot here before, during, and after the war, and trying to cement this relationship, and how we get to a point that Mussolini protected the church, and after the war, the church effectively now is left to govern with the liberal world sort of, within its midst. And this is where we get into the problems of Vatican II and some of the problems of the church later on. And we're all living through that now. So That's why this relationship with Mussolini and Pope Pius XI is so important. Now, here we go. Pope Pius XI came into office for the chair of Peter on February 6, 1922. Mussolini would come in about 9 months later on October 30th, I believe, 1922. So both men ascend to power in Italy, right? Obviously, the Pope being, of course, the universal leader of a global institution, obviously, but still, because again, the heart of the Catholic Church at the Vatican is in Italy, you effectively have these two men that come into power together. And very early on, from my understanding, there's a relationship that's built between the two men that leads to the 1929 Lateran Accords, which you all know Mussolini cut a deal with the king and with the church to bring back Holy Mother Church, right? To make the Catholic Church the integralist faith of Italy, effectively made the Catholic Church the official religion of Italy. Now, it did not discriminate against other religions in the sense that you couldn't practice it, but it was the Catholic Church that became the official religion of Italy, which made sense that the population was 98% Catholic, right? While still protecting minority rights. That's one thing that Mussolini negotiated, right? And the church went along with that. Now, we fast forward. There's questions about fascism early on. People are trying to figure out. Now, let's remember, right? I'm going to try and piece this together as best I can. Recently, I heard that before Mussolini had this transition to fascism, he had a conversation with Padre Pio, right? The beloved Catholic saint. In fact, interesting enough, there's a copy of a letter out there that I've seen where Mussolini refers to Padre Pio as a fellow fascist, right? Now, a lot of people are going to find this offenseful. I don't have a problem with it at all, because you have to understand the nature of Catholicism at the time. And it is said, from what I've heard, I don't know if this is true, I've said this before on this series, that it was Padre Pio that informed Mussolini that Marxism, remember, he was a Marxist, he was a socialist, really bordering on Marxism before his transformation, before he entered the war, World War I. It was Padre Pio that basically told him, listen, Marxism and Catholicism are incompatible. And you're going to have to, rethink this issue. And hence, after Mussolini gets back from the war, at some point between, 1917 and 1922, this ideology of fascism in some capacity, right, with Giovanni Gentili, and I'm sure a few other thinkers, comes into existence that is really not a contradiction against Catholic doctrine and Catholic dogma. This was Padre Pio, from what I understand, that made Mussolini, made him understand about this contradiction, and hence fascism, which is different than Marxism, because what you're going to hear from a lot of Anglo Protestant types, libertarian types, is that Marxism and fascism are simply two sides of the same coin, right? They're effectively two gangs fighting it out in the streets. And of course, nothing could be a bigger misrepresentation of what fascism actually was, whether you agree with it or not, right? Whether you agree with this idea of authoritarianism that downplays some elements of individual rights, right? Well, it looks to more of a collective understanding of society. It was fascism that never robbed people of private property. It never collectivized. It did not persecute the proletariat, and it did not destroy religion. In fact, it elevated religion to a status equal to itself. That's what the 1929 Lateran Accords were. So this is why, again, in the Rochelle Mussolini book, when she talks about the Lateran Accords, one of the Monsignors that the Mussolinis knew very well in 1929, obviously, at that point, Mussolini is the head of state at that point. One of the One of the priests they knew came to the house and in great joy and with a bottle of champagne, I believe. They popped the champagne. Donna Mussolini, your husband, has brought the church back effectively, right? Bringing back its glory. The priesthood, the monsignors, the bishops, the cardinals, it was a state of jubilee. That's what's interesting about this, right? Is that this was a very big deal because he answered the question Romana, and that is, what is the role of the church in a nation where you had a secular monarchy, where no other leader could solve that question in Italy at the time? Mussolini did that, and with that, it wasn't only that it gave the prestige and the glory and the rightful place to the Catholic Church back in Italy, but it united the entire nation, right? Because remember, because of the Risorgimento, the unification of Italy, you had all these provinces with different traditions and different dialects and different customs that really had nothing to do with one another. Mussolini used the church to unify Italy as one nation so they could finally see each other as one nation. Now, granted, some of these differences still play out to a certain degree in Italy today, but it was the moment that Italy really became Italy with the ratification of the, again, Lateran Accords, right? That Mussolini put together. That's why it was such a glorious event. Remember, a place like Sicily at the time, because it lacked industry, it lacked natural resources, 50% of the male population were laborers, day workers. They didn't have consistent employment. And because most of the land was owned by aristocrats, right? It was even difficult to get people back on their own land to work in sort of in a more agricultural farming type system. This is why Sicily was moving toward Marxism, right? As Marxists are coming in to place their influence in a nation that can't solve a lot of its economic stresses because it doesn't have the infrastructure and the natural resources. Marxism became very attractive in areas where poverty was rampant because they promised to solve some of these problems by wealth redistribution. Well, how do you deal with a part of the nation, Sicily, that's so poor, doesn't have the industry, is primarily agricultural and fishing? That's what pretty much everybody did, right? My parents, or should I say my father, was in construction, right? That's what he grew up in. My father's family, they all did construction, right? So you had these basic labor jobs over there. But it was inconsistent for most people because you don't have, again, that industrial base. And so Marxism became very appealing. But in signing the Lateran Accords, there's one other factor: how Mussolini actually got the poor parts of Italy to really join in on this idea of Italianness, and that is to bring in the Catholic faith. Because while Sicily was very poor, it was very Catholic. It was the most devout part of Italy, most devoutly Catholic. And so by bringing a church in, right, he consolidated all of Italy together as a Catholic nation, because in most parts, while Sicily was, more religious and the cities were more secular, obviously, in totality, that whole peninsula was pretty much Catholic. And by bringing in the church, he effectively unified a bunch of these provinces that were always at odds with one another. So it was, again, restoring the glory and the prestige of the church while unifying the Italian people as finally something worthy of being called Italians. So you got Mussolini does that. So he signed the Lateran Accords, and then we get into 1931. Now, remember, the fascist ideology is kind of, at the time, in many ways, it's trying to figure itself out, right? Remember who Mussolini was. Mussolini was a guy that was very malleable in his political ideology. They said with Mussolini, he was a big proponent of free speech, right? Because free speech was a Roman concept. And Mussolini, being born some 50 miles south of Rome in the Romagna district, was big on the idea of free speech and the idea of engaging in political dialogue. This is who he was. This is who his father was. This is what they did. from a tradition of sorts that he picked up from his father. Now, a lot of people criticize Mussolini because he shut down some of the newspapers, but that's a different story, right? Because freedom of the press and freedom of speech are two different things. And Mussolini, who was a journalist, had problems with freedom of the press because freedom of the press was always subject to special interests buying out the free press. Where we've seen that before, right? We've seen it in modern times all over the West now. Mussolini understood this, right? That's why Mussolini did not shut down all the newspapers, but there was some he had to shut down because they were bought and paid for by international interests that were affecting the political dialogue. You got to ask yourself, is that right or wrong? How's that worked out in America with special interests buying out all of the media? It hasn't worked out. It's one of the biggest problems we have as Americans today, especially if you're a right of center. Now, there's going to be a bigger conversation that we'll talk about that some other time. And so Mussolini was big on dialogue. And if you could make a good case politically on Mussolini, he would listen to you. And he'd be open to changing his mind. It's one of the things that's very interesting about him. And so, but as we get into the 1930s, here's where we go with this relationship, right? We get to 1931. 1931 is interesting because you get several things that are very contradictory in nature. The first of which is that Mussolini was awarded the highest, what do you want to call it, award that a lay person could ever receive in the Catholic Church. What is it? The Scepter of the Holy Cross? I believe, I forgot what it was. The name of the award that a lay person could receive. Pope Pius XI bestowed that on Mussolini. And then Pope Pius XI was quoted as saying that Mussolini was a man sent by divine providence. There was something prophetic about Mussolini in Italy. We would actually hear that later on from some of the mystics later on, but that's for another time. And yet, in 1931, we get the encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno, which was a condemnation of, it was not a condemnation of fascism. I think it was a condemnation of the regime, because fascism never actually was condemned by the church. Now, what was Non abbiamo bisogno? It was over Catholic action. And who would get the kids first? Would it be the church or would it be the fascist regime in regards to education, right? And development of the youth. And this is interesting because there were several problems going on when this happened, because the church pushed for its rights. The moment Mussolini gave them, this authority back, this position in Italy in 1929 with the Lateran Accords, the church took with it and ran with it, and Pope Pius XI was very vocal about the position of the church in Italy. The problem that was going on at the time was that Catholic action, from my understanding, and if I'm wrong, somebody correct me, is that Catholic action was being infiltrated by Marxists. And this is a problem for Mussolini and the fascist regime. Who was going to get the kids first? Now, am I just going to give the fascist regime the most purest and noble, what do you want to call it, benefit of the doubt? No, of course not. The fascists had their own indoctrination programs as well too, right? There was something something that I'm going deeper into, fascist mysticism, which was a school in and of itself, so people could think in the terms of what fascism was at the time. So you had this battle between the church and what was originally a secular ideology. And then eventually, the two are kind of merged together by Mussolini. And how this relationship kind of breaks down and develops over time, there was bumps in the road. Catholic action was one of those bumps in the road. And this led to the encyclical Non abbiamo bisogno in 1931, I believe was the year. Mussolini, what do you want to call it, outlawed it from being published in the Italian newspapers. But guess who was more than happy to print it in their newspapers? The French, of course, right? The French, a government made out of socialists, radicals, Freemasons, they were more than happy to publish the letter of course publicly in order to embarrass the fascist regime, right? And these are the ideological battles that are going on all over Europe at the time, right? This is the byproduct of the French Revolution and how these battles are happening long before we even get to World War I and World War II later on. So this is published in 1931, and then Mussolini and the church, they get together and they work it out, right? Something happens to where they come to an agreement. Mussolini agrees to, what was it now? He allowed the church to have the kids at the diocesan level, and the church had to promise that there could be no politicking within the realm of Catholic action, because the concern is there was many radical Marxist priests within the church in Italy already that were wanting to radicalize the youth. Remember the priest Don Sturzo, right? The Sicilian priest with the crooked nose, as Mussolini called them. He had a confrontation with Mussolini. Mussolini banned him out of the country. He went to England, where England was more than happy, the Anglo Protestants, to allow him to write everything negative about, of course, Italian fascism. I think he was booted out of the country. It was either in 24 or 26. So these battles are happening on the ground. And so at that point, Mussolini and the church, Pope Pius XI, they reconcile after non abbiamo bisogno. Then the next thing that we learn is in 1933, 1934, that Mussolini develops a close relationship with Cardinal Schuster, I believe is who it was. In fact, the article that I saw, I'll have to find it again and source it here for you guys. I think it was from Catholic News Agency or something like that, said that Cardinal Schuster actually became Mussolini's spiritual advisor by the mid-1930s. And that's interesting. We kind of fast forward all the way to 1938. And so what we have, according to the timeline, between 31 and 38, after Non abbiamo bisogno, right, is relative peace. In fact, there's that story out of Raquel Mussolini's book where they're in that town in Italy. They're visiting the town. They're having some problems. The mayor of that Italian town, I forgot which town it is. I'll look it up for you guys. There's issues going on, right? There's infrastructure issues, and Mussolini's there to oversee what needs to be done. He's being escorted all over the town by the mayor. And it's interesting because as Mussolini is dealing with the affairs of the state, there was a convent of cloistered nuns in that town. And Raquel Mussolini, who's effectively what do you want to call it, the first lady, goes to the nun. She's a woman. She can walk into the convent there, right? Men are not allowed in at the time inside these convents of cloistered nuns. And she's basically there to help, or at least to ask the nuns, right? She speaks to the superior mother there saying, okay, is there anything we can do for you? And the superior mother, or the mother superior at the time, said, yes, I'd like to talk to the Duce. Can you have the Duce come over here? And Raquel was somewhat perplexed about this request because men are not allowed in this, again, in this convent. But she was very insistent with Raquel, and Raquel said, okay, I'll go talk to my husband, right? Mussolini is doing this thing over there. Raquel goes back to where Mussolini is conducting affairs of state. And Raquel says to Benito, she says, listen, the Mother Superior would like to talk to you. And she's very, very insistent that she wants to talk to you. And Benito was puzzled. And she says, well, Raquel, I can't go in there. No men are allowed in those convents. If I do that, if I walk in there, this could cause another crisis with the church. And things are going so well right now with the church. So this is sometime in the early 30s. I think it was in 33, right? 33, 34. And he's hesitant because he doesn't want problems with the church. He's really leaving the church alone at that point. But Raquel was like, wait a minute. She's very insistent, Benito. I really want you to come. I just think, she's kind of given her approval, kind of a thing. I think the Vatican's going to be okay if she gives the approval. So he goes, okay, sure, whatever. Okay, let's go over there. And Benito shows up. They open the gates up, and all the nuns, the sisters, had set up refreshments for Benito, along with Raquel, the mayor, and who knows how many other sort of dignitaries, diplomats that Mussolini went around with. And Benito asked the Mother Superior, how can I help you? She goes, basically, Mr. Prime Minister, we're really hurting for funds here. Our convent is very poor, and we have repairs, and we're in need of help from the state. And Benito's like, well, okay. I mean, you could have contacted my office, and, but she was insistent that Benito actually give her money in that instant, in that moment, right? And he was thrown back by that, and he said, well, wait a minute. I don't have my checkbook on me, and, if you contact my office, we'll help you out. He goes, no, Duce, I need it now. I need it now. And Benito, being puzzled by this event, looked at kind of the mayor of the town and said, hey, do you have your checkbook on you? I kind of pay you back. Can you write them out the check, what they need? And the mayor said, sure, I'll do that, right? And so they write the check out, they hand it to them, and then they mingle, right? Chit chat, and they're kind of just, they've gotten through the business stuff. And after a while, Benito was very insistent about why the Mother Superior was so insistent on demanding for the money now, rather not, contacting the office, which is, more of a, the process at the time, especially with government. And the response from the Mother Superior was, because Duce, it's you, Duce, that I trust, not the government. If I go to the government and ask for money, they'll put me through one bureaucratic system after another. I don't trust the government, Duce. I trust you. And Mussolini was kind of thrown back by that. And, that's kind of where the story ends. He leaves and things of that nature. But again, as we lay out this relationship between the church and Mussolini, it's another story, anecdotal, without a doubt. This comes from Raquel, right? And again, we got to consider the source. And is Raquel being biased in favor of Benito, just giving us a story, right, to make him look good? But the book was written 29 years after the death of Mussolini. That book is copyrighted, I believe, 73 or 74, right? No, 72, because Benito died. No, wait a minute. 74. It was written in 74 because Benito died in 45, 29 years later. That's 1974. At that point, Raquel is an older lady. She's in her last days. She's kind of laying out. It's one of the best books I've ever read, right? On a biography of Mussolini, because it really does give the insight, whatever you may think of it. And it shows, again, a nature of the relationship between Mussolini and the church as something of a positive light. So we got this story. We got the relationship with Colonel Schuster. We got a good relationship, right? Basically, from 1922 to 1938, with that really one bump in the road, major bump in the road in 1931 when No Abbiamo Bisogno. And I'm sure there was a few other things, right, in between there. Don't get me wrong. I'm highlighting the things that I've read and some of the bigger issues. And then we get to 1938. What happens in 1938? 1938, Mussolini signs the Pact of Steel with Hitler. And I believe it's 2 or 3 months later, Mussolini passes the discrimination laws against the Jews. Okay? Now, whatever you may think of discrimination laws against the Jews, we'll talk about that some other time. This was something that the church didn't want to deal with, from my understanding, right? And basically condemned Mussolini for doing this. Now, again, I have to explain this. The discrimination laws in Italy were not the same as in Germany. Nobody was killed. Nobody was sent to concentration camps. There was camps, but they were holding grounds so Jews could find somewhere else to live. And Mussolini made sure that none of them got sent to Germany because he understood the nature of what was going on over there. And it didn't take into account all Jews, only a certain segment of them, right? Well, this made the Vatican feel very uncomfortable. And it's when apparently the split between Pope Pius XI and Mussolini kind of begins at that point, right? So we have this great relationship, two men, peasant backgrounds. From my reading, they saw eye to eye for the longest time. And then, of course, comes the ascent of Hitler, who eventually becomes the alpha in the relationship. Italy being isolated specifically by the British foreign minister Anthony Eden, who, from my understanding, was a real pain in the rear, was a real douchebag from my reading of history, which basically splits Italy from Britain and France and forces them into the camp. Well, I don't say force, but it made Germany a natural ally to Italy. All of this over, of course, the war in Ethiopia, which is we've talked about before. There's nuance there because the British had their own interest there, and they felt their toes got stepped on because Italy went in there instead of them, right? Again, this is colonization. Nobody did it better than the British. But the fact is that, Mussolini got pushed out, right? Because remember the Stresa Conference in 1936, that was going to be the last stand that Europe was going to make against Hitler, because the entire time it was Mussolini warning all of Europe, listen, if you guys are going to come and stop this guy, you better come now because he's building one hell of a military. But the French and the British were going through appeasement movements. And even after they had an agreement at Stresa in 1936, it was the British that broke that alliance by making a private deal with Hitler in just 2 months after the Stresa Conference agreement, effectively making the Stresa Conference null and void. The British ruined that last stand to stop Hitler, right? A unified front of Britain, France, and Italy. And at that point, it's like, what does Mussolini do now? Because remember, the British still had that ocean, right? That the English Channel that kind of protected them. The French and the Italians were kind of screwed. Because the moment Hitler takes Austria, they're on the Italian border, just like France is on the border of Germany in the Rhineland, right? They're both screwed. Mussolini knew the power that Hitler had. He knew he wasn't going to be able to stop him alone. And the moment the British bailed, it forced Mussolini make a decision, whether it was right or wrong. Now, could he have avoided that? It's possible, right? I still blame Mussolini for not getting out of that situation, right? But I'm getting long-winded here. I'm trying to set up what is going on, right? Because this is very important. When we get to the 1938 and this alliance and eventually the Jewish discrimination laws, right? Well, the church had had enough at that point, apparently, from my understanding. And so World War II starts, and all kinds of bad stuff starts happening. And apparently, by I believe Pope Pius XI died in 1940, and apparently Pope Pius had the 11th had a letter ready to condemn both Nazism and Italian fascism, but he died, I think, 2 days before he released it. It was never released. So there's never an official condemnation of fascism. And then we get to Pacelli, right? Pope Pius XII, who becomes the next pope. And Pope Pius XII does not condemn Nazism or Italian fascism, right? He keeps the status quo. Why? Because Pacelli was a diplomat in Germany, and he thought he could work things out as a diplomat. Plus, as the war is going bad for Italy by 1940, well, actually, is it going bad in 40? I think it starts going bad 41, 42. But still, it's clear that the Germans are the power. Pacelli doesn't want this issue with the Germans right there. Because remember, eventually the Germans have to come in to bail out Italy as the Italian army is having some deep systematic issues because it wasn't ready to fight that war, right? What you got to remember is that even at the Pact of Steel, Mussolini was trying to buy time to stay out of the war. And he kept telling Hitler, I need 3, maybe 4 years to rebuild my factories, move them south out of the bombing lanes, right? I just fought a war in Ethiopia. I just helped Franco in Spain. I need time. And Hitler said, yeah. And 2 months later, Hitler's going into France. And Mussolini's like, well, wait a minute. What am I supposed to do now? Right? And that's where I think you got that fear and greed thing in Mussolini that Nicholas Farrow in his book A New Life talks about, where he thought, okay, well, Hitler's going in. Let me get my troops going, all right? So I could have a say-so at the negotiating table, because he always thought it would be a quick war. And in many respects, it was, right? Up until, the Operation Barbarossa, which is Hitler going into Russia. Hitler effectively won the war up until that point. So, Pope Pius XII comes in, he keeps the status quo. We go through the war. It goes bad for Italy. 1943, the king deposes Mussolini as the leader. He places him up on the top of Sasso, right? Mount Sasso, or the Grand Sasso up in the mountain. Otto Scorsese, sent by Hitler on gliders, rescues or captures Mussolini, depends on which interpretation you want to accept, takes him back to Munich. Mussolini says to Hitler, listen, I just want to be with my family. I'm out of power. I want to retire. And Hitler says, no, it ain't going to be that easy. I need you to form a new government in northern Italy. And at that point, the Germans were the full military force defending the Italian peninsula against the Allied invasion that started in Sicily. And this is where we get the Republic of Salo. And then we get to Republic of Salo. This is when apparently Mussolini now is gravitating back to his Catholic faith at this point. When he was at the island of Ponzo as a prisoner of the king, he read the book, The Life of Christ. He asked the priest at the island of Ponzo to say a mass for his deceased son, Bruno. They say that Mussolini went to private mass and confession at Salo as well, too. If you read the unpublished constitution of the Republic of Salo, it is there that Mussolini puts the Catholic Church in as the official religion of the Republic of Salo, which is pretty interesting. Considering if he was about to be condemned by Pope Pius XI, does he need to do that, right? I don't know. And so, I don't know what to say, because I'm laying out a very rough timeline of things, events, and ebbs and flows with the relationship with the church and the relationship with Pope Pius XI, and every side uses their own sort of timeline of picking and choosing to make a case, right? Those that want to condemn fascism would say, well, listen, Pope Pius XI, he wrote that letter. He was about to condemn Mussolini and the fascists. There you go right there. We got to distance the church from Mussolini and say that Catholicism and fascism had nothing to do with one another. On the other hand, we have all these timelines of history and an intricate relationship between Mussolini and the church, where Mussolini did a lot of great things for the church. And we know that he had a relationship with Padre Pio. We know he started to find his faith at the end of his life. We know that, again, the Republic of Salo in the unpublished constitution, right? He made up with the church over Catholic action. Cardinal Schuster was his personal, again, spiritual advisor. So how do we put this together? And that's the question. And I'm trying to get to the bottom of this, because my suspicion is that this is my suspicion for the victors of World War II, right? Whether it's the classical liberals or the Bolsheviks, I believe we've been given a specific narrative, right? They have rewritten history, right? Fascism and Mussolini have been vanquished the ash heap of history, right? Mussolini was nothing but a dumb brute at the end of the day. He was a moron. He was an idiot that bungled his way into the ruin of Italy and himself, right? That's the interpretation we get. I think it's horrible interpretation. It's the narrative that the communists always give, right? Well, classical liberals do it too, though. I mean, especially the British. The British created sort of this good and evil narrative, and it translates over into American politics in modern times as well, too. But the question is, how does relationship work out at the end of the day? Many Catholics, especially American Catholics, who have no ties in regards to heritage to whether it's Italy, whether it's Spain, whether it's Germany, any of the Catholic nations, and they view American history in a prism that, okay, America went into World War I and especially World War II to fight tyranny and to liberate Europe from all this tyranny, right? That's the view. Those Catholics oftentimes that have no ties to the Latin part of Catholic Europe, they don't like this association with fascism, right? Because effectively it's a political argument. How can Catholicism be associated with fascism, right? Because fascism is so evil at the end of the day. That's the perception from the Western liberal mindset that the British Anglos have established, and many Americans are tied to that kind of perspective. But for those Latin Americans in Italy, Spain, even Germany, and Germany is more complex. I get that with Hitler. I completely understand it. But half that country is still Catholic, right? And while from a Western liberal perspective, we're saying we went in there to liberate Europe, right? The tyranny of Europe, and we sacrificed and we brought in the Marshall Plan and all this money, and we did all these great things to liberate Europe. And the only thing we asked for is a little plot of land to bury our dead, right? That's the narrative we've been given. But when you listen to the Catholics at the time in those Latin nations, none of them wanted either the Bolshevism from the East or the Anglo-Protestantism from the West. They felt they were being infringed upon. This is why there was no real challenge to Mussolini's power in Italy. Now, the British and the Americans were offended at the idea of fascism in Italy, right? And this is why they had to come into Italy and other, again, integralist or authoritarian Catholic nations, and for the sake of those people, impugn democracy and liberalism, right? Because the Anglo-Protestants believe they're doing a service, a good deed, a good moral deed, right? But for those Catholic nations, they understood the nature of democracy. And in many ways, the problems we're going to today, you read those Catholics from those nations back then, they understood the nature of the problem of democracy and what was going to happen to the West if you vanquish Catholic civilization. It's like Hilaire Belloc said, Europe was Catholic and Catholicism was Europe. Europe was the church. The moment the Protestants and the Bolsheviks collide against the Catholic world, Europe changes forever, and with it, Christianity dies, right? And this is why this book here that I've bought here, right, Botched Victory, it points this out. Christianity has collapsed since World War II, with the liberal republics in charge of half of the globe, right? Primarily Britain and America, and the Bolsheviks for 70 years in charge of the other half of the world. How did Christianity collapse? How did it collapse? Did it collapse under its own accord? No, it didn't collapse under its own accord. It collapsed only after it was invaded. And it had foreign ideas, ideologies, and political movements infused within those nations and those countries. This is how you get a Spanish nation, an Italian nation, a Portuguese nation, an Austrian nation that were devoutly Catholic before the war. What's happened since that time? The faith has collapsed everywhere, under the dictates of liberalism. And then we get Catholics that want to run and hide from this history. And I'm telling you, there's more nuance there. I get it. I know the pressure we're under because of the failed Austrian patriot. I get that, right? I understand it. But there's even nuance there. But we're not allowed to even consider that nuance, because then we're called bigots, right? For certain events that happened at that time, which actually had nothing to do with the war itself. That's the irony of it all. But it feeds into the narrative. It gives it moral legitimacy to the Western liberal republics and to the Bolsheviks, right? And now that Marxism has crept into the rest of the West, including Britain and America, we're all like kind of looking around like, wait, what happened to the West? What happened to the West? You know, that's why I ask, who were the good guys in World War II? Did the good guys really win because our history books tell us that? I don't know. I don't know. I think it was much more convoluted. I believe there's much more nuance. But what I do know is I prefer for Catholics to interpret their own history rather than to have foreigners, whether it's Protestants or Jews or British or Americans or Bolsheviks or communists or Australians, right? To interpret that history. Now, maybe we've all been, well, not we, but maybe Italians have been made to feel guilt over that war because Italy was liberalized after World War II. Now, Germany, for sure, there is a guilt complex because there was massive social engineering after the war, right? After the Morgenthau Plan was introduced between 45 and 47, which was an American plan by Secretary of Treasury Henry Morgenthau and Harry Dexter White, kind of his underling, who was one of being a Soviet spy, according to the Venona cables, right? After their plan to exterminate the entire German race as vengeance after the war, right? That didn't go well because America was still kind of Christian and Protestant at the time. And they say the Germans were like a month away from all being starved to death, the entire race. They were going after all of them. We don't hear about that. They had to come up with a different plan because Americans, whatever you may say about Americans, and I may have my critique of the American government, Americans are good and decent people. They always have been. Once they heard about the Morgenthau Plan, it wasn't going to fly. So the administration, the liberal administration, again, 2 world wars in America conducted by far leftist, quasi-communists, right? In Woodrow Wilson and FDR, they come up with the Marshall Plan. That was actually Plan B. Most people don't know that. Plan A was the Morgenthau Plan. Just exterminate the Germans after the war. But when that got back to everyday Americans who were uncomfortable with that, Plan B was the Marshall Plan, right? What have you heard about the Marshall Plan? Oh, it was a bunch of money, right? A bunch of loans, a bunch of money from America to help rebuild Europe, right? This is what we do. We drop bombs in order to overthrow your regimes, your culture, your customs, right? Your traditions, all which are backward ass because freedom and liberty is not involved. And then after we bomb you and liberate you from these tyrannical ideologies, we give you a bunch of money in order to help you sort of rebuild your nations, right? Right? Well, according to E. Michael Jones, the Marshall Plan came with a lot of stipulations and a lot of social engineering. And this is why the Germans have been made to feel guilt. Lots of guilt as a sort of revenge. They couldn't genocide them with the Morgenthau Plan, but they were going to make them feel guilt with the Marshall Plan that was money and social engineering. And this is why Germany still struggles from great insecurities today because of that war. And what they've done to the German people, what the liberal republics have done, I think is a great crime. I'll be honest. That's my opinion. I'm not German. I did not favor Hitler or the Nazi regime in any way. They were very problematic, right? In my opinion. I look at Mussolini, Hitler as simply an alliance of geopolitics. It had to happen because of the way politics broke down. Again, the British screwing everything up. But I mean, there's a lot here, guys. And so I've kind of got off on a tangent. So I guess to end this, how do we assess this relationship between Mussolini, the fascist regime, and the church and Pope Pius XI? It's what I'm going to be digging into to find greater details. I'm hoping this book here helps me answer some of this. Obviously, going into Vatican II and the problems that were incurring the church after the war, that's going to be big too. Obviously, but I'm trying to find information, but I want my information to come from Catholic sources. I don't mind looking at outside sources, right? I don't, but I don't want it to be exclusively outside sources as I do my research. If you guys have any books you can recommend, any papers, any websites, to help understand this relationship between Mussolini and Pope Pius XI a little bit better, my sense is that they had a good relationship with some bumps in the road, but those bumps in the road are used by the liberal republics and by, should I say this, liberal-minded Catholics and even some trad Catholics to distance themselves because nobody wants to defend the greater premise of what World War II was, because the liberal republics and the communists have controlled that narrative and have written the history since that time. And a lot of people don't want to deal with it. They're afraid of it. They're terrified of it. I'm not terrified of it, man. I'm not. I say, let's look at this thing. Let's be honest. And get this thing going. Again, Pope Pius XI, Mussolini, what was that relationship like? That's what I'm looking to get into. All right, guys, I want to thank you for joining me. This is Frank, sign off for Frankly Speaking. Good night, everybody.